Terrorism is not a 21st century phenomenon and has its roots in early resistance and political movements. The Sicarii were an early Jewish terrorist organization founded in the 1st century AD with the goal of overthrowing the Romans in the Middle East. Judas of Galilee, leader of the Zealots and the key influence in the Sicarii, believed that the Jews should be ruled by God alone and that armed resistance was necessary. The most basic definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Depending on what country you're in, or even organization you're talking about, the definition of terrorism changes. In the United States, Title 18 of the United States Code defines terrorism and lists the crimes associated with terrorism. In Section 2331 of Chapter 113B, defines terrorism as activities that involve violent or life-threatening acts that are in violation of criminal laws of the United States or any state and appear to be intended to 1. To intimidate or coerce the civilian population, 2. To influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or 3. To affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and C. Occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. The United Kingdom's Terrorism Act 2000 defines terrorism to include an act designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system. An act of violence is not even necessary under this definition. The FBI defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Whereas the U.S. Army even has a definition. It is calculated use of unlawful violence or threat of unlawful violence to inculcate fear. It is intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies to attain political, religious, or ideological goals. Critics also accuse the United States of terrorism for backing not only the Israeli occupation, but other repressive regimes willing to terrorize their own citizens to maintain power. Palestinian militants call Israel terrorist, Kurdish militants call Turkey terrorists, Tamil militants call Indonesia terrorists, and, of course, the nation-states call the militants who oppose their regimes terrorists. Like beauty, terrorism is in the eye of the beholder. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, hence the difficulty in defining terrorism. If we attempt to apply relativism to terrorism by describing it as the idea that there is no absolute truth, knowledge, or morality, and that each culture forms its own sense of what's true or false or what is right or wrong, then we could say yes, this thought supports terrorism, therefore terrorism isn't immoral. But then if we add to that some say the virtue of relativism is that it makes you less judgmental about other cultures, and that relativism derives from the belief that there is no God and that therefore there cannot be any absolute moral values. On the surface, we in the U.S. could initially look at this definition and say that it doesn't apply to terrorism because we immediately think of Islamic terrorism and jihads declared against the West in support of the Quran. Even though we've heard many times that Islam is a peaceful religion, Dr. Perez Amir Ali Hudui states that Islam, like Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, or any other religion, is not about peace, nor is it about war. Every religion is about belief in its own superiority and the divine right to impose its version of truth upon others. But if we take the Islamic out of the mix and focus on just terrorism, I think we could say that relativism can somewhat support terrorism and maybe even justify it. If we look at Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh, responsible for the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, or even Eric Robert Rudolph, who conducted the Centennial Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, none of them were in the name of any religious beliefs, but rather their belief in a cause or even as a form of retaliation against those they felt had done them wrong. So if we back up and use the initial description that each culture or person forms its own sense of what's true or false or right or wrong, then we could say this could justify terrorism. Deontology is an ethical theory that uses rules to distinguish between right and wrong. Everything you do, you can decide through pure reason. Despite its strengths, rigidly following deontology can produce results that many people find unacceptable. Looking at Kant's categorical imperative principle that when you are going to do something, imagine that everybody is going to do that same thing. Would that be a world you'd want to live in? In a terrorist's mind, this might be acceptable. Using this principle and returning back to the Islamic terrorism, many times it is in support of a jihad. If we look at the definition of a jihad, it says it is a meritorious struggle or effort. The exact meaning of the term jihad depends on context. It has often been erroneously translated in the West as a holy war. A jihad, particularly in the religious and ethical realm, primarily refers to the human struggle to promote what is right and to prevent what is wrong. Pragmatism is a branch of philosophy in which we assess truth in terms of effect, outcome, and practicality, knowing that it is the pursuit of practicality over the aesthetic qualities by a concentration on facts rather than emotions or ideals. We can see that no matter whether it's Islamic terrorist, domestic terrorism, or any kind of terrorism, pragmatism is the one area that may discredit terrorism as a morally just action. In looking at the various reasons for terrorism, both internationally and within the borders of the United States, I think it's safe to say that the emotion and ideology are at the root of each cause. In fact, if we return to Timothy McVeigh, he even states that the reason for his attack was for revenge against the federal government. Prior to planning the bombing, McVeigh said that he considered a campaign of individual assassination with eligible targets, including Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno. After the bombing, he was ambivalent about his act. He expressed in letters to his hometown newspaper, he sometimes wished that he'd carried out a series of assassinations against police and government officials instead. This shows he acted out of emotion rather than facts. Philosophy can make a significant contribution to this debate at two levels, the conceptual and the moral. Philosophers are good at spotting and disentangling confusions and debunking double standards. Although some embrace some version of relativism, others can help overcome it and put to rest the wicked cliche that one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. Philosophers normally avoid conflating the conceptual and moral levels of the debate. This makes it possible to construct a definition of terrorism that doesn't beg the moral or political questions. They bring to bear major ethical theories, introducing order into an array of moral arguments for and against terrorism, and helping people decide what position best reflects the moral values and political commitments.